What happens when Hollywood's most beloved action star walks into what he thinks is a friendly interview, only to discover the host has prepared an ambush that will destroy his reputation? Tonight we're breaking down the explosive confrontation that shocked everyone watching, the moment when Dwayne Johnson realized he wasn't dealing with a professional interviewer, but someone with a personal vendetta. This story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about late-night television. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is going to be one wild ride. The Jimmy Kimmel Live studio was buzzing with its usual pre-show energy as crew members made final adjustments to the lighting and sound equipment. Audience members were settling into their seats, phones at the ready to capture what they expected would be another entertaining interview with one of Hollywood's biggest stars. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, everyone excited to see Dwayne Johnson's trademark charisma and humor on full display. Behind the scenes, Johnson was going through his typical pre-interview routine. He had just finished in makeup, joking with the artists about how much product it took to maintain his polished look under the hot studio lights. His publicist briefed him on the standard talking points: promotional material for his latest blockbuster film, family updates that fans always loved hearing about, and maybe a few funny stories from the movie set. Everything seemed perfectly normal and routine. Jimmy Kimmel, however, had spent his preparation time very differently. Sources close to the production later revealed that the host had been researching controversial moments from Johnson's career, digging up old tabloid stories and industry gossip that had long been debunked or taken completely out of context. He had prepared a series of loaded questions designed not to entertain his audience, but to catch his guest off guard and create a viral moment at Johnson's expense. The show opened with Kimmel's usual monologue, his jokes landing well with the studio audience who had no idea what was about to unfold. When he introduced Johnson, the crowd erupted in genuine enthusiasm. The Rock strode onto the stage with his signature confidence, that million-dollar smile lighting up his face as he waved to the cheering fans. He looked every inch the consummate professional, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit that perfectly complemented his imposing physique. The first few minutes of the interview proceeded exactly as expected. Kimmel asked about Johnson's latest film, praising his performance and asking about the intense physical preparation required for the role. Johnson responded with his characteristic warmth and humor, sharing behind-the-scenes stories that had the audience laughing and engaged. He talked about his training regimen, joked about his massive appetite, and even did his famous eyebrow raise when Kimmel mentioned his wrestling background. But those watching carefully might have noticed subtle signs that something wasn't quite right. Kimmel's smile seemed forced, his laughter a beat too late. There was an edge to his questions that went beyond typical late-night show banter. When Johnson mentioned his production company and the projects he was developing, Kimmel's response carried a hint of sarcasm that seemed oddly personal. As the interview continued, Kimmel began steering the conversation toward more sensitive territory. He brought up Johnson's transition from wrestling to acting, but instead of focusing on his impressive career trajectory, he questioned whether Johnson had really earned his success or simply benefited from his physical presence and marketing machine. The questions were phrased cleverly, disguised as legitimate interview topics, but there was an underlying hostility that Johnson was beginning to pick up on. The audience started to sense the shift in energy as well. The comfortable laughter that had filled the studio during the opening minutes became more scattered and uncertain. People were beginning to exchange glances, unsure whether what they were witnessing was part of some elaborate bit, or if genuine. Tension was building between the host and his guest. Johnson, drawing on years of experience handling difficult interviews and hostile crowds during his wrestling career, maintained his composure and professionalism. When Kimmel made a particularly pointed comment about actors who rely more on their image than their talent, Johnson simply smiled and redirected the conversation back to his film and the hard-working cast and crew who had made it possible. But Kimmel wasn't finished. In fact, he was just getting started. The host leaned back in his chair, adopting a posture that suggested he was settling in for a much longer and more confrontational conversation than anyone had anticipated. His next question would be the one that finally revealed his true intentions for the evening. The moment when this seemingly routine celebrity interview would transform into something much more dangerous and unpredictable. "You know, Dwayne," Kimmel said, his tone shifting noticeably as he prepared to drop his first real bombshell, "there have been some interesting stories coming out of Hollywood lately about certain actors who might not be quite as nice behind the scenes as they appear in public." The studio fell noticeably quieter, the audience sensing that they were about to witness something they hadn't signed up for when they came to see a light-hearted late-night talk show. Johnson's smile faltered slightly, but his years of media training kicked in immediately. He knew exactly what Kimmel was trying to do, and he wasn't going to take the bait easily. "Well, Jimmy, I think anyone who's actually worked with me would tell you that I try to treat everyone with respect and professionalism," he replied, his voice still warm but carrying a new undercurrent of caution that hadn't been there moments before. Kimmel pounced on that response like a predator who had just spotted weakness in his prey. "That's interesting that you mention people who've worked with you, because I've been hearing some fascinating stories from people who claim they have worked with you. Stories about demands for special treatment, about entire scenes being rewritten to make you look better, about co-stars being pushed aside to accommodate your ego." The accusations hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning the atmosphere of what should have been a fun and entertaining interview. The audience was now visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as they watched their beloved guest being attacked without provocation. Some people were pulling out their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in late-night television history. Johnson's jaw tensed slightly, the first real sign that Kimmel's strategy was having an effect. But instead of lashing out, he took a deep breath and responded with measured professionalism. "Jimmy, I'm not sure where you're getting your information, but I can honestly say that I've never demanded special treatment or tried to diminish anyone else's role in a production. I take pride in being a team player and supporting everyone involved in making great entertainment." Kimmel wasn't satisfied with that diplomatic response. In fact, it seemed to fuel his determination to provoke a more explosive reaction. "Come on, Dwayne. We both know how this business works. Everyone's too intimidated to speak out against the big action star who can make or break their careers. But I've done my research, and the stories I'm hearing paint a very different picture of who you really are when the cameras stop rolling." The host began rattling off a series of increasingly specific and damaging allegations, each one more outrageous than the last. He claimed that Johnson had demanded his own personal chef on every set, that he required a private gym to be built wherever he was filming, that he had forced rewrites of major scenes because he didn't like how his character was portrayed, and that he had even had other actors' dialogue reduced to give himself more screen time and better lines. With each accusation, Johnson's composure became more strained. His media training had prepared him for difficult questions and even hostile interviews, but this was something entirely different. This was a calculated character assassination being broadcast to millions of viewers, and it was being conducted by someone who was supposed to be a professional colleague in the entertainment industry. "These are serious allegations you're making, Jimmy," Johnson said, his voice dropping to a lower register that those familiar with his wrestling career would recognize as a warning sign. "And they're also completely false. I think you owe it to your audience and to me to reveal your sources for these claims, because anyone who knows me or has actually worked with me would never say such things." Kimmel leaned forward, sensing that he was finally getting the reaction he had been hoping for. "My sources are people who were brave enough to speak truth to power, people who are tired of watching certain celebrities get away with outrageous behavior just because they're box office gold. Maybe it's time someone held you accountable for the way you really conduct yourself in this industry." The word accountable seemed to strike Johnson like a physical blow. Here was a talk show host, someone who had never worked on a film set, never dealt with the pressures of carrying a major motion picture, never had to manage the complex relationships between cast, crew, and studio executives, lecturing him about accountability and professional behavior. Accountable? Johnson repeated, his voice now carrying an edge that made several audience members visibly nervous. You want to talk about accountability? Let's talk about a host who invites guests onto his show under false pretenses, who ambushes them with unsubstantiated accusations, who uses his platform to spread lies and damage reputations. Where's the accountability in that, Jimmy? The confrontation had now moved far beyond the realm of typical late-night television. This wasn't playful banter or even edgy comedy. This was a genuine conflict between two men, one of whom was trying to maintain his professionalism, while the other seemed determined to destroy him for the sake of creating a viral moment. Kimmel's response revealed just how far he was willing to go to achieve his goal. I'm just asking the questions that other people are too polite or too scared to ask. Maybe it's time someone challenged this perfect image you've created for yourself. Maybe your fans deserve to know who you really are behind all the charm and the carefully managed public relations. That was the moment when something fundamental shifted in Johnson's demeanor. The friendly, accommodating movie star who had walked onto the stage was being replaced by someone much more dangerous and unpredictable. The audience could sense the change immediately, and the energy in the studio became charged with tension and anticipation. Johnson slowly rose from his chair, his impressive frame casting a shadow over Kimmel, who suddenly looked much smaller and more vulnerable than he had moments before. The movement was deliberate and controlled, but it carried with it an unmistakable message of power and barely contained anger that sent ripples of nervous energy through the studio audience. You want to know who I really am, Jimmy? Johnson's voice boomed across the studio, no longer the carefully modulated tone of a polished celebrity, but the commanding presence of someone who had dominated wrestling rings and movie screens around the world. I'm someone who has worked incredibly hard to build a career based on respect, professionalism, and treating every single person I encounter with dignity. I'm someone who remembers what it was like to struggle, to work multiple jobs just to survive, and who has never forgotten where I came from. Kimmel, perhaps finally beginning to realize that he had pushed too far, attempted to regain control of the situation. Dwayne, please, sit back down. This is just what we do here. This is entertainment. You know I'm just having some fun with you. But his words sounded hollow and desperate. The confident smirk that had characterized his earlier attacks now replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. Fun? Johnson's laugh was devoid of any humor, a sound that seemed to echo off the walls of the studio and settle into the stunned silence that had fallen over the audience. You think destroying someone's reputation is fun? You think spreading lies and making false accusations about someone's character and work ethic is entertainment? Let me tell you something about fun, Jimmy. Fun is what I thought I was coming here to have tonight. Fun is what these people in your audience expected when they came to see a talk show. This isn't fun. This is a hit job. The host made one final, desperate attempt to justify his actions. Look, I'm just doing my job here. I ask tough questions. I challenge my guests. That's what good interviewers do. If you can't handle a little pressure, maybe you shouldn't be in this business. The words were clearly meant to provoke an even more explosive reaction, but they had the opposite effect. Instead of escalating his anger, they seemed to crystallize Johnson's resolve. A little pressure? Johnson shook his head slowly, his expression a mixture of disgust and disappointment. Jimmy, I've faced pressure you couldn't even imagine. I've performed in front of crowds that wanted to tear me apart. I've carried movies that cost hundreds of millions of dollars and employed thousands of people. I've dealt with real criticism, from real professionals who actually knew what they were talking about. What you're doing here isn't pressure. It's just cruelty disguised as entertainment. The studio had fallen so quiet that the hum of the cameras and lighting equipment seemed unnaturally loud. Audience members were staring in stunned disbelief, many of them recording what they knew would become one of the most talked-about moments in television history. Even Kimmel's own crew seemed uncomfortable with what their boss had orchestrated, several staff members visibly shaking their heads in disapproval. Johnson began walking toward the front of the stage, his decision clearly made. "I came here tonight to talk about a movie that I'm proud of, to connect with fans who have supported me throughout my career, and to have a good time with someone I thought was a professional colleague. Instead, I find myself being subjected to a planned attack designed to humiliate me and damage my reputation for no reason other than your own desperate need for attention." Kimmel made one last pathetic attempt to salvage the situation. "Dwayne, come on, don't be like this. We can work this out. Maybe I got a little carried away, but you know how television works. Sometimes you have to push boundaries to create compelling content." That's all this was. But his words fell on deaf ears. Johnson had heard enough, and his mind was completely made up. Push boundaries? Johnson paused at the edge of the stage, turning back to face Kimmel one final time. There's a difference between pushing boundaries and abandoning basic human decency. There's a difference between creating compelling content and destroying someone's character for your own entertainment. You crossed that line tonight, Jimmy, and you did it deliberately and maliciously. Without another word, Johnson stepped down from the stage and began walking up the aisle toward the exit, leaving behind a studio full of shocked audience members and a host who looked like he had just been hit by a freight train. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the silent studio as he made his way toward the doors, his head held high despite the unprecedented nature of what had just occurred. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of the most dramatic exit in late-night television history. Kimmel sat frozen in his chair, seemingly unable to process what had just happened, or how to proceed with the rest of his show. The audience remained in stunned silence, many of them looking around at each other as if seeking confirmation that what they had just witnessed had actually occurred. As Johnson reached the exit doors, he paused for just a moment, not to look back at the chaos he was leaving behind, but to acknowledge the audience members who had been subjected to Kimmel's unprofessional behavior along with him. He gave a slight nod of appreciation to the people who had come expecting entertainment and instead had been forced to witness a character assassination attempt. Then he was gone, disappearing through the exit doors and leaving behind one of the most uncomfortable and shocking moments in the history of late-night television. The studio remained silent for several long seconds before the reality of what had happened began to sink in for everyone present. So what do you think about this incredible confrontation? Have you ever seen a guest stand up to a host like this before? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let me know if you think Johnson was right to walk away. And don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable stories from the world of entertainment.